When you think of Roman emperors, you probably picture powerful men ruling through political cunning and military might, carved in marble with stern faces and noble bearing, commanding legions across 3 continents with the authority of gods made flesh. But there was another kind of power at work in the imperial palace, something far more twisted and personal than the conquest of barbarian tribes or the administration of distant provinces. Power that could transform a beautiful young boy into an empress through the surgeon's blade. Power that could erase identity with a command and reshape human flesh according to the whims of a madman. Power that could turn love into something so perverse that even the Romans, no strangers to cruelty and excess, recoiled in horror and whispered prayers to their gods for protection from such abomination. In the marble halls of Nero's palace, where purple silk curtains whispered across polished floors of precious stone and incense burned day and night in golden braziers, lived a youth whose very existence challenged every boundary that Roman society had carefully constructed over centuries of conquest and tradition. The boy's name was Sporus, though that was almost certainly not the name his mother had whispered to him as an infant. The word itself comes from the Greek for seed or semen, a cruel epithet designed to mock what had been carved away from him with surgical precision. He lived in the shadow of the most notorious emperor in Roman history, a man whose name would become synonymous with madness and depravity for millennia to come. Nero Claudius, Caesar Augustus Germanicus, ruled the known world from Britain's misty shores to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, commanding wealth that would make modern nations tremble with envy. Yet for all his power over provinces and peoples, it was his dominion over this single youth that would come to define the ultimate corruption of his reign. This emperor had already murdered his own mother, kicked his pregnant wife to death in a fit of rage, and poisoned his stepbrother while maintaining pleasant conversation with dinner guests. But none of these crimes prepared the Roman world for what he would do to Sporus. Here was an emperor who had not merely taken a boy as a lover, which would have been scandalous but comprehensible within Roman sexual culture. Instead, he had attempted something that challenged the very categories through which Romans understood human existence. He had tried to transform male into female, slave into empress, mortal into ghost, through nothing more than imperial will and surgical intervention. What you will discover about Sporus will challenge everything you thought you knew about the limits of human cruelty and the price of absolute power, unchecked by law, tradition, or moral restraint. His story illuminates not just the depths of one emperor's depravity, but the terrible machinery of Roman society that allowed such horrors to unfold in broad daylight before hundreds of witnesses. It reveals how beauty could become a curse more terrible than any physical deformity, how powerlessness could be weaponized against its own victims, and how the human spirit could endure degradations that would have broken lesser souls, while still finding ways to assert some measure of dignity and resistance. To understand how Sporus came to occupy such a unique and terrible position in Roman history, we must first understand the world that shaped both him and his imperial tormentor. The Rome of the 1st century was a society built on conquest and hierarchy, where power flowed downward through carefully maintained channels of dominance and submission. At its apex sat the emperor, a figure who combined the roles of general, high priest, judge, and living god in a synthesis of authority that would have impressed the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Sexual relationships in this world followed patterns that would seem alien to modern observers, governed by complex rules about dominance and submission that reflected broader social hierarchies. Roman men were expected to be the active partner in any sexual encounter, whether with their wives, their slaves, or occasionally with other men of lower social status. What mattered was not the gender of one's partner, but one's role in the relationship and the social positions of those involved. To penetrate was considered manly and acceptable. To be penetrated, especially for a Roman citizen, was shameful and effeminate. The emperor, who would transform Sporus into a living ghost, was born into this complex world on December 15th in the year 37, during the reign of his great-uncle Caligula. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was known throughout Roman society for his cruelty and perverse appetites. He once gouged out the eye of a knight in the forum simply because the man had disagreed with him during a public debate. When friends congratulated him on the birth of his son, Ahenobarbus reportedly declared that any child born to him and Agrippina could only bring disaster to the state and ruin to the Roman people. Agrippina the Younger was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and ruthless determination, the great-granddaughter of Augustus himself and sister to the emperor Caligula. From the moment of her son's birth, she understood that he represented her path to ultimate power, and she would stop at nothing to place him on the throne that she believed was his by right of blood and inheritance. The young Lucius showed early signs of the artistic temperament that would both elevate and damn him in the eyes of traditional Romans. He loved poetry, music, and the theatre, with a passion that his tutors found both promising and deeply troubling. Yet even as a child, Lucius showed an insatiable hunger for applause and public recognition that traditional Roman education could not satisfy. His mother carefully orchestrated his rise to power with the skill of a master strategist. In the year 49, when the boy was 12 years old, she married her uncle, the Emperor Claudius, bringing her teenage son into the imperial household as potential heir to the throne. Claudius formally adopted his stepson in the year 50, giving him the name Nero, Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, and marking him as heir to the throne. In the year 54, when Nero was just 16 years old, Claudius died suddenly after eating a plate of mushrooms prepared by his wife's servants. Many suspected poison, though nothing could be definitively proven. Within hours of the emperor's death, the teenager found himself hailed as emperor by the Praetorian Guard. The early years of Nero's reign were marked by relative stability and competent governance, guided by the steady hands of his former tutor Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Sporus. But even in these early days, disturbing patterns emerged. Nero showed little genuine interest in the traditional duties of an emperor, preferring to spend his time writing poetry, practicing music, and planning theatrical performances that scandalized traditional Romans. His marriage to Claudia Octavia, Claudius's daughter and his own stepsister, was a political arrangement entirely devoid of affection. Nero's first serious extramarital relationship was with Claudia Acte, a freedwoman and former actress whose exotic beauty captivated the emperor's imagination in ways that his wife's conventional virtue never could. But it was Poppaea Sabina who would change everything. She entered Nero's life like a force of nature, beautiful and intelligent and utterly without scruple in her pursuit of power and position. She was a master of psychological manipulation, using her considerable beauty and intelligence to gradually separate Nero from his advisors, his family, and anyone else who might restrain his worst impulses. Under her influence, Nero began to see critics not as loyal servants offering honest counsel, but as enemies who deserved punishment for their presumption. The first victim of this new ruthlessness was Britannicus, Claudius's son and Nero's potential rival. In the year 55, the young man died suddenly at a dinner party, his face turning dark with what experienced observers recognized as the effects of poison. But it was the death of Agrippina that truly revealed the monster lurking beneath Nero's artistic facade. After attempts with a collapsing ceiling and a specially constructed boat designed to break apart at sea both failed, Agrippina was finally murdered in her seaside villa by soldiers who claimed afterward that she had died by suicide. With his mother dead and his remaining advisors thoroughly cowed, Nero felt free to pursue his relationship with Poppaea more openly. He divorced Octavia on obviously false grounds of barrenness and elevated Poppaea to the position of empress, with ceremonies that rivaled those of the gods themselves. For a brief period, it seemed that Nero had found happiness. Poppaea bore him a daughter, and he wrote poems celebrating his wife's beauty and composed songs that displayed a tenderness few had ever seen in him before. But this domestic bliss was shattered by tragedy in the year 65, when Poppaea died under circumstances that remain controversial to this day. According to the accounts of Tacitus and other contemporary historians, Nero had killed his beloved wife in a fit of rage, kicking her pregnant belly after she complained about his late return from the races. The impact on Nero was immediate and devastating. The emperor fell into a profound depression, wandering through the palace at all hours like a ghost, haunting the scenes of his former happiness. It was in this condition of grief, guilt, and psychological instability that Nero first encountered the boy who would become Sporus. The emperor's obsession with his dead wife had created a psychological vacuum that demanded to be filled, and the youth's resemblance to Poppaea made him the perfect target for an experiment in resurrection that would challenge the basic categories of human existence. The transformation began with a command that even the most hardened Roman courtiers found difficult to contemplate without visible revulsion. Nero ordered the boy castrated with surgical precision, offering enormous financial rewards to any physician brave enough to attempt the complex procedure. This was not simply the crude removal of male organs practiced for centuries in creating eunuchs. The emperor was asking for something far more comprehensive and dangerous, a surgical attempt to transform male anatomy into something that might approximate female form. Recovery from such operations was lengthy, painful, and frequently fatal due to infection, blood loss, or other complications that ancient medicine was ill-equipped to prevent or treat. Those who survived faced a lifetime of physical and psychological consequences that extended far beyond the immediate surgical trauma. The removal of male hormones affected voice, muscle development, body hair, and other secondary sexual characteristics, creating individuals who occupied an ambiguous position between male and female. While the youth recovered from his ordeal, Nero began planning the elaborate spectacle that would announce his new empress to the world. The emperor commissioned the finest seamstresses and tailors in Rome to create feminine clothing in the exact style favored by the dead Poppaea. Every detail was planned with obsessive attention to historical accuracy and symbolic meaning. The fabrics were dyed in the specific shades of purple and gold that had been Poppaea's favorites, while jewelers worked day and night to recreate the elaborate accessories that the dead empress had worn during state ceremonies. The wedding ceremony itself was planned with all the solemnity and magnificence traditionally reserved for imperial marriages. The ceremony took place during Nero's extended tour of Greece, probably in the year 67, when the emperor was at the height of his infatuation with Greek culture. The victim appeared in a bridal veil of finest silk, his surgically altered body draped in cloth of gold and adorned with jewels that had belonged to generations of Roman empresses. Nero played the role of bridegroom with elaborate ceremony and obvious satisfaction, addressing his bride by Poppaea's name throughout the proceedings and speaking to him as if he were actually the dead empress returned to life. After the ceremony, Nero presented his new bride to the wider court with obvious pride, showering him with the titles and honors appropriate to an imperial consort. Life as Nero's empress brought privileges that most slaves could never imagine, but these came at a terrible psychological cost. The daily routine required constant performance of femininity, from wearing women's clothing and jewelry to adopting speech patterns and mannerisms considered appropriate for Roman matrons of the highest social rank. Every public appearance was carefully staged to reinforce the illusion that this arrangement represented a genuine marriage. The constant scrutiny and performance demanded by this role created a form of psychological imprisonment that may have been even more damaging than the physical mutilation. Every moment of existence was dedicated to sustaining Nero's delusion and demonstrating imperial power over the basic categories of human identity, leaving no space for authentic self-expression or genuine human relationship. Behind the public pageantry lay an even more intimate horror. The emperor's treatment of his ersatz bride in private demonstrated how completely he had lost touch with reality, speaking to the youth as if he were actually Poppaea and sharing memories of their supposed past together. Nero seemed genuinely to believe that his surgical intervention had accomplished something magical, bringing his dead wife back to life in a new body. Contemporary Romans struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing, since the relationship challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, marriage, and imperial authority that had been taken for granted for centuries. Some observers interpreted the relationship as evidence of Nero's complete moral collapse and unfitness for office. Others saw it as a grotesque parody of traditional marriage, designed to mock established social institutions. As months passed, cracks began to appear in the carefully constructed facade. The youth's voice, permanently altered by the castration, could never perfectly mimic the feminine tones expected of a Roman empress. His movements and gestures, while modified through intensive training, retained subtle traces of masculine bearing that no amount of practice could entirely eliminate. These small imperfections served as constant reminders of the impossibility of Nero's central premise, gradually undermining the emperor's confidence while increasing his desperation. The elaborate fiction began to show serious strain as political pressures mounted throughout the empire during the late months of 67 and early 68. Provincial governors who had once accepted the emperor's eccentricities now began to question openly whether a ruler who paraded a mutilated boy as his empress possessed the judgment necessary to govern the Roman world. The crisis that would ultimately destroy both emperor and victim began with a revolt in Gaul, led by Julius Vindex, crushed by loyal legions, but serving a crucial catalytic function by demonstrating that opposition to Nero was possible. The most significant potential usurper was Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, whose distinguished military record made him an attractive alternative to Nero. Nero's response to these mounting challenges revealed the extent to which his judgment had been compromised. Rather than taking decisive military action, the emperor retreated into increasingly elaborate artistic projects and public performances that horrified his remaining supporters. He continued to appear in public with his surgically created bride, seemingly oblivious to how these displays were accelerating the collapse of his remaining credibility. The final crisis arrived when Galba's agents successfully bribed key members of the Praetorian Guard and convinced them to abandon Nero. According to contemporary accounts, Nero's first concern upon learning of the Praetorian defection was not for the empire's welfare or even for his own safety, but for what would happen to his beloved bride in the chaos that was certain to follow his downfall. The collapse of Nero's regime unfolded with shocking speed. Within days, the emperor found himself declared a public enemy by the Roman Senate and abandoned by virtually all his supporters. During these final desperate hours, the castrated youth remained by Nero's side when almost everyone else had fled. This loyalty was remarkable given the treatment he had endured, suggesting either a complex psychological bond with his captor or simply recognition that his own survival was tied to the emperor's fate. The small group of refugees who accompanied Nero in his flight from Rome made their way through darkened streets toward temporary sanctuary at a villa owned by the freedman Phaon. When news arrived that Galba's forces were systematically searching the countryside and that discovery was only a matter of time, Nero began to contemplate suicide as his only remaining option for maintaining some vestige of dignity in death. Nero spent his final hours composing poetry and practicing theatrical gestures, reportedly muttering the famous phrase, "What an artist the world is losing." The most poignant detail involves the role of the castrated youth in the emperor's preparations for death. Nero turned to his surgically created bride for comfort and support, speaking to him as if he were actually Poppæa and seeking some form of absolution for the crimes that had brought them both to this desperate end. When the crucial moment arrived and Nero found himself unable to take his own life without assistance, he begged his castrated companion to help him commit suicide. But the youth refused this final request. Instead, the task fell to Epaphroditus, another freedman, who guided the emperor's trembling hand as he drove a dagger into his own throat. The emperor died on June 9th, 68, exactly 4 years to the day after the death of his first wife Octavia. His final words, "Too late, this is fidelity," suggested a belated recognition of the loyalty that had sustained him even in his final moments. The death of Nero plunged the Roman Empire into a period of civil war that historians would later call the Year of the Four Emperors. In this atmosphere of constant violence and political uncertainty, individuals like the castrated youth became pawns in larger games of power they could neither understand nor control. His unique status as Nero's former bride made him both valuable and dangerous to the various factions competing for imperial authority. The young man's first guardian after Nero's death was Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect, who had played a crucial role in orchestrating the emperor's downfall. Under his protection, the youth continued to live in the artificial role that had been imposed upon him, wearing feminine clothing and being addressed by Poppæa's name as if nothing had changed. But when Nymphidius attempted to claim the throne for himself, his own guards turned against him in a violent confrontation that ended with his death. The next phase began when he fell into the hands of Marcus Salvius Otho, who had been Poppæa's first husband before Nero stole her away. Like Nero before him, Otho treated the young man as a substitute for the dead empress, continuing the pattern of using him as a vessel for others' emotional needs rather than recognizing him as an independent human being. But Otho's brief reign lasted only 3 months before he was defeated in battle by Vitellius and chose suicide rather than prolonging the civil war. His situation became far more dangerous when he fell under the control of Vitellius, who had no personal connection to Poppæa or sentimental attachment to her memory. The new emperor saw the castrated youth not as a precious reminder of lost love, but as a symbol of everything that had been wrong with the previous regime. This perception made the youth a perfect target for public humiliation that would demonstrate Vitellius's commitment to restoring traditional Roman virtue. Vitellius decided that the castrated youth would be forced to participate in a gladiatorial reenactment of the rape of Proserpina, the same mythological scene that had been depicted on the ring the boy had given to Nero. The symbolism was intentional and cruelly ironic. The person who had been forced to play the role of an empress would now be compelled to perform as a victim of divine sexual violence before a cheering crowd. The planned spectacle represented the ultimate degradation for someone who had already endured transformations that challenged the very foundations of human identity and dignity. Faced with this ultimate humiliation and the certain knowledge that survival was impossible, regardless of his cooperation or resistance, the castrated youth made the only choice that remained available to him. Rather than submit to Vitellius's sadistic entertainment, he chose to end his own life on his own terms, asserting a form of agency that had been denied to him throughout the years of his captivity and exploitation. The decision to commit suicide represented both a personal tragedy and a final act of defiance against the system that had destroyed his original identity while denying him any authentic alternative. The suicide occurred sometime in the year 69, when the youth was probably not yet 20 years old, bringing to an end a life that had been shaped entirely by the whims and obsessions of more powerful individuals. The manner of his death is not described in detail by ancient historians, but the timing suggests that it was carefully planned to avoid the public spectacle that Vitellius had arranged. The story of the young man known as Sporus ultimately transcends its historical origins to become a meditation on fundamental questions that remain relevant across time and cultural boundaries. His experiences illuminate the complex relationships between power and identity, the remarkable resilience of the human spirit under extreme duress, and the moral challenges faced by individuals living under authoritarian systems that treat human beings as objects to be manipulated. The castrated youth who served as Nero's unwilling empress died nearly 2,000 years ago, but his story continues to speak to contemporary readers because it addresses universal human concerns about dignity, autonomy, survival, and the irreducible core of selfhood that persists even under the most dehumanizing circumstances. His legacy lies not in any direct historical influence he exercised, which was necessarily limited by his powerless position, but in his capacity to serve as a symbol of both human vulnerability and human resistance in the face of overwhelming institutional power. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson of his story is the reminder that behind every historical statistic, imperial scandal, or moral cautionary tale lie individual human beings whose experiences of suffering and survival deserve to be remembered, honored, and learned from. His life was shaped by forces entirely beyond his control, but his final act of choosing death over further degradation demonstrated that even the most thoroughly oppressed individuals retain some capacity for meaningful choice and authentic self-expression. The memory of his suffering serves as a permanent indictment of systems that treat human beings as disposable objects, while his final act of resistance offers hope that the human spirit cannot be entirely crushed, even by the most systematic oppression. In choosing death over further humiliation, he asserted the fundamental principle that some things are more important than mere survival, that human dignity has value that transcends physical existence, and that even the most powerless individuals possess an inner core of selfhood that cannot be entirely controlled or destroyed by external force.